Tonight, we drift slowly back to the vast empire of Rome. In the 2nd century of our era, the streets hum with the sound of sandals on stone, of merchants calling out their wares, of soldiers marching in perfect rhythm. The marble columns rise above the city, polished and gleaming under the Mediterranean sun. Amidst this grandeur, one boy is destined not only to rule the greatest empire on earth, but also to write words that will outlive the empire itself. His name was Marcus Aurelius. Unlike many emperors, he was not remembered for cruelty, nor for wild extravagance, nor for endless conquests. Instead, he was remembered as a man who turned inward, a man who sought wisdom in silence, and strength in philosophy. He would be called the Philosopher King, a ruler who carried the weight of the empire on his shoulders. And yet, in the quiet of the night, scribbled notes to himself, words of calm, of courage, of endurance. These words would become the Meditations, one of the most timeless books ever written. But before he was emperor, before he was a philosopher, he was simply a boy, born into a Rome that could not yet know how much he would shape it. And so, tonight, we will tell his entire life, slowly, carefully, detail by detail, a story to ease the restless mind, and to let history carry you gently into sleep. We begin, as always, at the beginning, with his birth. In the year 121 AD, Marcus Aurelius was born on the 26th of April. In the year 121 AD, during the reign of Emperor Hadrian, Rome at that time was a city of marble and noise, of triumphal arches and bustling markets. But the story of Marcus begins not in the roar of the forum, but in the quiet cradle of an aristocratic household. His family was noble, though not among the richest. His father, Marcus Annius Verus, died when Marcus was still a child, leaving him under the care of his mother, Domitia Lucilla. She was wealthy in her own right, descended from a family that owned brickworks near Rome, and her fortune ensured that young Marcus would never lack for tutors, books, or opportunity. Yet she was also known for her simplicity, her devotion, and her piety, qualities that would shape her son far more than gold ever could. Marcus grew up in a household where discipline was quiet but constant. The Romans believed that boys of noble birth must be prepared not only to command but also to endure. From his earliest years, Marcus was taught that life was not about indulgence but about duty. He would later write in Meditations of his gratitude to his mother, remembering her as an example of piety, generosity, and restraint. Hadrian, the emperor at the time, took notice of the boy early. Marcus was serious beyond his years, with dark eyes that seemed always to be watching, always to be listening. He preferred solitude to games, study to play. This earned him the nickname Verissimus, the most truthful one, a play on his family name, Verus. Even as a child, he carried himself with a quiet gravity. At the age of 12, Marcus adopted a way of life that startled his companions. He began to wear a rough Greek cloak, sleeping on the hard floor, living with a simplicity that even adults would have found difficult. His devotion to philosophy had already begun, and he practiced it not as theory but as discipline. His mother had to persuade him, eventually, to soften these habits for the sake of his health. But the boy's love of austerity never left him. His tutors were among the best that Rome could provide. He studied rhetoric, philosophy, literature, and law. Junius Rusticus, one of his most influential teachers, would later give him a copy of Epictetus's Discourses, a gift that changed the course of his mind forever. Rusticus taught Marcus not only how to speak but how to think, how to restrain anger, how to turn inward for strength. To Rusticus. Marcus would later write in Meditations, "From Rusticus I learned to read carefully, not to be satisfied with a rough understanding of things, and not to be too quick in giving my assent to those who talk glibly." Another important teacher was Fronto, a master of rhetoric. From Fronto, Marcus learned the art of language, of persuasion, of finely crafted sentences. Yet even here, Marcus showed a tendency to drift away from mere eloquence toward deeper matters. He admired Fronto's skill, but he longed for wisdom, not just words. By the time he reached adolescence, Marcus was already different from other young men of his rank. Many of his peers sought entertainment, chariot races, and the pleasures of wealth. Marcus sought silence. He spent long hours in study, writing notes to himself, reflecting on mortality, on virtue, on the fleeting nature of human life. These quiet exercises were the seeds of what would one day become Meditations. Though still only a boy, Marcus Aurelius was already walking the path of the philosopher. He carried within him a sense of destiny, not in the boastful Roman fashion, but in the quiet certainty of one who knew that the truest battles are fought not on the field, but in the soul. And so, in the quiet rooms of a Roman household, with tutors guiding his mind and a mother guiding his spirit, Marcus Aurelius began his journey. The boy who wore a philosopher's cloak and slept on the floor would one day wear the purple robe of an emperor. But for now, he was still only a child, serious, watchful, and already listening to the inner voice that would guide him all his life. As Marcus Aurelius grew from boyhood into adolescence, the Roman world around him shifted. He was still young when Emperor Hadrian, the restless and brilliant ruler of the empire, noticed his seriousness. Hadrian was nearing the end of his long reign, and though he had traveled the empire, built walls, and left monuments across the known world, he was without a direct heir. The question of succession weighed heavily on him. Hadrian observed Marcus carefully. The boy's gravity, his self-discipline, and his unusual devotion to philosophy struck the emperor as remarkable. Though Marcus was not in line for the throne by blood, Hadrian considered him a possible candidate for adoption, the Roman method of securing succession. Still, Marcus was young, and Hadrian's health was failing. The emperor chose another man first, Antoninus Pius, a respected senator known for his mild character and steady loyalty. Yet Hadrian placed a condition on Antoninus. If Antoninus was to be adopted as emperor, he must in turn adopt Marcus Aurelius and another boy, Lucius Verus. In this way, Hadrian set the future in motion. Antoninus would succeed him, and Marcus, in time, would follow Antoninus. Thus, Marcus Aurelius, still in his teens, suddenly found himself drawn into the heart of imperial destiny. He was adopted into the household of Antoninus Pius, and with this adoption came both privilege and immense responsibility. No longer was he only a philosopher's pupil, now he was a future emperor in waiting. Antoninus Pius was a man of extraordinary patience. His reign would later be remembered as one of peace and stability. Unlike emperors before him, he waged no great wars, pursued no reckless conquests. Instead, he governed with moderation, fairness, and attention to law. This steady character left a deep impression on Marcus. Living in the household of Antoninus was like studying philosophy not from books, but from daily example. Marcus would later write that from Antoninus he learned self-control, equanimity, and the ability to meet fortune with calmness. During these years, Marcus's education continued with intensity. He mastered Greek and Latin, read widely in literature and philosophy, and deepened his study of Stoicism. The writings of Epictetus, the former slave turned philosopher, became a guide for him. Epictetus taught that freedom lies not in external circumstances, but in mastery of the mind. Marcus absorbed this teaching deeply, preparing himself for the day when the storms of power would test him. Yet his life was not without struggle. Marcus was frail in health, prone to illness, and often weary from study. His love of austerity sometimes weakened his body. He was no soldier in youth, no athlete, no picture of Roman vigor. But what he lacked in physical strength, he made up for in endurance of spirit. He learned to bear discomfort without complaint, to accept hardship without bitterness. These lessons would serve him in the years ahead, when the empire itself would groan under war and plague. Lucius Verus, the other boy adopted alongside Marcus, grew up with a different character. He loved games, pleasures, and the lighter side of life. Where Marcus was serious, Lucius was carefree, yet the two would remain bound together, eventually ruling side by side. In their youth, they were like contrasting images, one drawn toward philosophy, the other toward enjoyment. Perhaps it was Hadrian's wisdom to bind them both to the empire's future, balancing sternness with ease. As the years passed, Marcus Aurelius became inseparable from the rhythms of Antoninus's court. He sat in the Senate. He observed judgments. He learned the slow machinery of Roman governance. He was not rushed into power, but patiently prepared. Antoninus trusted him with duties gradually, letting him taste responsibility without overwhelming him. In this way, Marcus was shaped not only by philosophers but by the daily practice of ruling. And so, under the calm guidance of Antoninus Pius, Marcus Aurelius grew into a man who embodied both discipline and humility. He was a student of philosophy, yet he was no longer apart from the world. He was being trained to hold the empire in his hands, to face burdens that would break lesser men. The boy who once slept on the floor in a philosopher's cloak now walked the marble halls of power. His future was no longer only his own. Rome had claimed him, and soon, the empire would test whether the young philosopher could also become a king. By the year 161 AD, Rome's long peace under Antoninus Pius was drawing to an end. The emperor, who had ruled with patience and moderation for more than 2 decades, was aging. His health declined, and with it came the question of succession. The path had already been laid. Marcus Aurelius, the adopted son, was to succeed. Yet few could have imagined that Marcus would not rule alone. When Antoninus died in March of that year, the Senate moved swiftly to confirm Marcus as emperor. But Marcus, true to his character of humility and fairness, insisted that his adoptive brother, Lucius Verus, should share the rule with him. And so, for the first time in Roman history, the empire was governed by 2 emperors together, co-Augusti, equal in title if not always in influence. Marcus and Lucius were different men. Marcus was reserved, philosophical, austere. Lucius was more carefree, more drawn to pleasures, less disciplined. Yet Marcus saw the wisdom of unity, of honoring Hadrian's plan, of presenting to the world not rivalry but harmony. This decision set the tone for Marcus's reign, a reign marked not by arrogance, but by a constant balancing of duty, of humility, and of care for the greater whole. In these early years, Marcus Aurelius faced burdens that tested him deeply. Almost immediately, the empire was threatened on multiple fronts. In the east, the Parthians stirred, challenging Roman authority in Armenia and Syria. Lucius Verus, more inclined to the military than Marcus, was dispatched to oversee the campaigns. Yet though Lucius carried the title, it was the discipline of Marcus that ensured the legions were supplied, the generals held accountable, the strategy sustained. Rome emerged victorious. But Marcus had already learned a hard truth: even in peace, the emperor must bear the weight of endless vigilance. At home, Marcus sought not glory but justice. He gave careful attention to the Senate, never treating it as a formality. He spent long hours hearing cases, reading reports, drafting replies. His handwriting filled scroll after scroll. Often in the quiet hours of the night, he preferred plain clothing, a life free from excess, and meals that were simple: bread, figs, a little cheese. His modesty stood in contrast to many emperors before him, and to many courtiers around him. But even in these calmer years, shadows gathered. The first whispers of plague began to spread from the east, carried by soldiers returning from campaign. It would become the Antonine Plague, a terrible epidemic that would haunt Marcus's reign for years, draining the empire of lives and strength. For now, it was only a cloud on the horizon. Marcus's personal life also shaped his early rule. He had married Faustina the Younger, the daughter of Antoninus Pius. Their union was strong, if not without trials. Together they had many children, though not all survived infancy, a common sorrow in the ancient world. Marcus bore these losses with the same stoic resolve he applied to public affairs, turning grief into reflection, and sorrow into endurance. Through all this, Marcus Aurelius continued his habit of writing. In the midst of politics, in the stress of command, he turned to his journal. These private notes were never meant for the world, yet they would become his greatest gift to posterity. He wrote to himself of patience, of the shortness of life, of the need to remain just even when others were unjust. Already in his early reign, his meditations revealed a man who sought not power's trappings, but its responsibilities. The Rome of Marcus Aurelius was still secure, still vast, still rich, but beneath the marble, cracks were beginning to form, in its health, in its borders, in its confidence. Marcus had ascended to the throne not to bask in peace, but to carry Rome through storms. Thus began the reign of the philosopher king, a ruler who would spend less time in palaces than in camps, less time in luxury than in hardship, less time in peace than in struggle. For Marcus Aurelius, the purple cloak was never a crown of ease, but a burden of duty, and though he did not know it yet, the greatest trials of his life were still to come. The early calm of Marcus Aurelius's reign did not last. Beyond Rome's northern borders, along the winding line of the Danube River, pressure was building. The tribes of the Marcomanni, the Quadi, and others who lived beyond the frontier were restless. Hunger, migration, and the shifting tides of power drove them southward, toward Rome's fertile provinces. At first, it seemed a distant trouble, a matter of border skirmishes. But soon, it became clear that the empire faced not a minor raid but a major invasion. Waves of tribes crossed the Danube, breaking through the defenses, threatening cities that had long been safe. Panic spread among Roman settlers. Entire communities fled before the advancing tribes. For the first time in centuries, the heart of the empire felt vulnerable. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher turned emperor, found himself called to be a soldier. He had not sought war, but war had come to him. He left behind the marble halls of Rome and moved north to the frontier, where he would spend much of the rest of his reign. Life on the frontier was harsh. The winters along the Danube were bitter. The camps cold and muddy. Supplies were hard to move. Disease spread easily. And the enemy was fierce, striking swiftly before vanishing into the forests. Yet Marcus endured it all with the same discipline he had practiced since youth. He slept as his soldiers slept, ate as they ate, and shared in their hardships. This won him loyalty. For the troops knew that their emperor was no distant figure but a companion in suffering. Even in the midst of battle, Marcus kept writing. In the dim light of his tent, with the sound of soldiers around him and the distant roar of the river, he penned words to himself, reminders of patience, reflections on mortality, notes on virtue. These fragments, collected after his death, would become meditations. They were not speeches for the Senate, nor manifestos for the public. They were quiet words, written by a man who sought to remain human amid the inhuman weight of war. But if war tested Rome's strength, another enemy soon tested its very survival, the Antonine Plague. It began, as plagues often do, quietly. Soldiers returning from campaigns in the east carried with them a sickness unlike any seen before. It spread swiftly, leaping from city to city, carried by trade routes and crowded streets. Fevers burned, bodies broke out in sores, and death followed in numbers too great to count. Historians still debate what the plague truly was, perhaps smallpox, perhaps measles. Whatever its cause, its effect was devastating. Whole towns were emptied. The army, already stretched thin on the frontier, was weakened further by disease. In Rome itself, funeral pyres burned constantly, filling the air with smoke. Marcus did not flee the plague. He remained in the city when needed, ensuring that order was kept, that aid was given as best it could be, and that the dead were honored. He accepted that disease was a part of life's fabric, just as war was. In his writings, he reminded himself, do not act as if you were destined to live 10,000 years. Death hangs over you, while you live, while it is in your power. Be good. The combination of war and plague weighed heavily on the empire. Revenues shrank. Legions faltered. Fear spread. Yet Marcus continued. He raised new armies, sold palace treasures to fund the defense, and pressed forward against the tribes. Slowly, painfully, Rome regained ground. The invasions were beaten back. The Danube frontier restored, though never entirely secure. Through it all, Marcus remained calm. He had no illusions of glory. He knew that war was misery, that plague was cruel, that life itself was fleeting. But he also knew that virtue lies in endurance, in justice, in facing suffering without surrender. And so, the emperor who had once been a boy in a philosopher's cloak now stood at the edge of empire, fighting not only foreign tribes, but disease, despair, and the frailty of human life. His reign, once expected to be peaceful, had become a long trial by fire. Yet Marcus Aurelius endured, as soldier, as ruler, and above all, as a man who never ceased to whisper wisdom to himself. Even in the darkest nights, the final years of Marcus Aurelius's reign were years of endurance. The wars along the Danube dragged on, consuming resources, lives, and the emperor's strength. The Antonine Plague still lingered, flaring in waves, leaving sorrow in its wake. The empire remained vast, but its edges were fraying, and at the center stood Marcus, weary, aged, yet unyielding. By now, he was no longer the young philosopher in a rough cloak, nor even the middle-aged ruler balancing peace and war. He was an emperor weathered by trial, his face carved by lines of care, bore witness to sleepless nights, to loss, to the heavy burden of ruling not in times of calm but in times of constant strain. And yet, even in these burdens, Marcus continued to turn inward. His writings, the notes we now call meditations, were composed during these restless campaigns. By firelight in military camps, or in the silence of early dawn, he wrote to himself. He did not write for glory, nor for readers, but as a way of remembering, of grounding his mind in virtue when the world pressed heavily upon him. His words are simple, almost stark, reminders to remain calm, to accept death, to be just even when surrounded by injustice. You could leave life right now, he told himself. Let that determine what you do and say and think. In those brief lines, the emperor's heart is laid bare, a man who ruled the known world, yet feared not losing it, because he had already learned to let go. At home, sorrow continued. Several of his children died young. Losses that pierced him deeply. Faustina, his wife, remained his companion through much of his reign, but her death in 175 AD left him grieving. Still, he endured, as he always did, folding grief into the fabric of his philosophy. His relationship with his surviving son, Commodus, was more troubled. Commodus would eventually succeed him, but he was unlike his father in almost every way, indulgent where Marcus was austere, reckless where Marcus was thoughtful. Perhaps this was the emperor's greatest personal disappointment, that the wisdom of a lifetime could not shape the character of the son who would inherit the throne. Yet Marcus did not despair. He accepted even this as part of the pattern of fate. To him, the task was not to control outcomes but to remain virtuous in the face of them. He reminded himself, waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be. Be one. In his later years, Marcus's health declined. The years of war, the strain of command, the constant travel across harsh frontiers had worn his body thin. Still, he refused to retreat into comfort. He stayed with his legions on the frontier, leading not from palaces but from tents, enduring the same cold winds and meager rations as his men. This steadfast presence inspired loyalty, even love, from soldiers who saw in him not only a ruler, but a comrade. In 180 AD, while still on campaign along the Danube, Marcus Aurelius fell ill. He knew the end was near. Those around him reported that he faced death with the same calm he had practiced in life. He asked not for lavish ceremonies, but for composure, for dignity, for acceptance. And so, in a military camp far from Rome, the philosopher king breathed his last. His body was returned to the capital, and with it, an era ended. Rome had seen emperors who were cruel, emperors who were reckless, emperors who sought only glory. But Marcus Aurelius was remembered as something different, a man who tried, against all odds, to live with wisdom, justice, and restraint. His book of private thoughts, preserved by chance, became his true monument. Meditations survived the fall of empires, the ruin of centuries, the silence of time. Even now, its words whisper across ages, reminding us of what Marcus himself most valued, not conquest, nor wealth, nor power, but the quiet strength of a mind at peace with itself. And so, the story of Marcus Aurelius, Rome's philosopher king, draws to a close. His life was not easy, nor was his reign calm, but in his endurance, in his writings, and in the calm example of a soul unshaken, he left behind a legacy that still whispers to us, softly, steadily, like the turning of the stars. And so, The story of Marcus Aurelius comes to its quiet end. A life of burden, of wisdom, of words that still whisper across the centuries. If this gentle telling has kept you company tonight, I invite you to return again. For more stories of forgotten kings, of ancient lives, and of history told slowly. Subscribe, if you wish, so that the next tale will find you when you need it most. And perhaps, when sleep is near, let history carry you once more into dreams.